So today I found out that Caruana and Karyakin are tied for first going to the last round, and they're playing in the last round. This is going to be awesome. I have no idea how the tie breaks work, so that should be interesting if they draw their game. Anyways, so today there was one decisive result. Uh, Nakamura beat Topalov with black. Uh, Caruana and Svidler had a really entertaining game, which went down to a rook and bishop versus rook table base ending. So we're going to look at that in some depth. Also, there was Aroni and Karyakin, who had a pretty interesting game, as well as Anand Giri, which also had some noteworthy moments. So we're going to begin with the table base game, and we're going to do something completely different for this one. Okay, so Caruana Svidler was 116 moves long, and we're not going to look at all 116 moves. We're going to pick it up at move 102. They've reached a rook and bishop versus rook ending, which in theory is supposed to be a draw, but it's not at all easy to defend if you're the side with the rook, even if you're a good player. In the last World Cup, Kramnik managed to win with the rook and bishop against a strong grandmaster. I forget who it was. But yeah, it is definitely easy to screw this up in practice, even if you are a strong player. You may have noticed we're not in chess base anymore. We've taken a little field trip. This is the Nalimov website, and we are using a table base right now because a lot of what we're going to discuss is relevant to table bases. And I was honestly far too lazy to relay the table base moves into chess base, so I gave up and went with this instead. So, like I was saying, um, optically it looks like white has made some progress because black's king is cut off at the edge of the board, and it looks like there's potential for some mating nets. Well, as you can see by the table-based evaluation of simply draw, white objectively hasn't made progress, but he's reached a situation where it's a lot easier for black to screw up than if his king is in the middle of the board, and definitely not getting mated in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, it's easy for black to screw up, and the thing about table bases is that they're scary. They rely on pure calculation, so sometimes optically the losing move and the drawing move look almost exactly the same, and the winning move and the move that doesn't win look almost exactly the same. But there's some subtle difference 15 moves down the line that you are only going to notice if you are a computer. So here Svidler went king a4, which, as you can see, loses in 20. Alternatively, you should play a different move. I would try to explain this, but explaining this would require actually understanding it, which I do not. So king a4 was played. Caruana did play king c4, which threatens rook a7 mate. Now, the problem currently for black is such that black would like to be able to stop the threatened mate in such a way that he'd like to be able to meet rook check with rook blocks. He can't obviously currently do that because the bishop on c5 is in the way. So you've got to give a check. That's the only way to attempt to do things. And bishop d4, which was played, and rook h5. Now, here Caruana played bishop f2, which according to the table base is not the most accurate. Let's quickly demonstrate the fastest winning line for the sake of I want to. So now you've got to stop the mate. Obviously, these moves get mated on the spot. These moves don't answer the mate. This move gives a check, loses the rook, and then gets mated afterwards. This move loses the rook and then gets mated afterwards. This move is a genuine attempt to stop the mate. So let's observe how the game could continue from this point. So threatening rook a1 mate, blocking that, threatening rook a6 mate. Notice now that rook h5, you can't set up a block with the rook anymore. So this is the key to white's strategy. He's using his bishop to block off spaces the rook would like to go to. And notice now that this rook's got no way of blocking anything. So he's now going to give up his rook, and then white obviously wins. Okay, so king a3 in this position wasn't very good. Let's try instead rook h3. This is the more natural move, wanting to meet rook a2 simply with rook a3. So if we try to go with the same strategy and go bishop c3, black's going to check back on h4, and we haven't really achieved much. Instead, the table base wants us to go bishop f2, which seems kind of random, but we're controlling the h4 square. So now let's check this move, which is sort of a waiting move. Bishop c5, so threatening rook a2 and not allowing the block on a3. Rook f4, bishop d4, rook f3, rook b4 check, king a3, rook b6, threatening rook a6. And again, from what I understand, White's strategy is that he wants to avoid this rook being able to block the check on the a file. So he's going to run with the king now. Rook b2 check, king a3. You obviously can't go to a1 because obvious reasons. You'll lose your rook and or get mated. And now rook e2. Yeah, so now if you try to make a waiting move along the third rank, such as rook to g3, then White's point is he's going to go bishop c5, king a4, and rook a2, mate. Or not mate right away, but rook a3, rook takes a3, mate. So instead, rook f4, pinning the bishop, not allowing White to execute his threat of bishop c5, king a4, rook a2. And now rook e1. Again, threatening mate in such a way that you can't block with the rook. And White wins now because rook a1 is mate. There's no running with the king. These are, when White threatens mate on the a file, there are two ways for Black to reply to it. He can either try to run with the king or try to set up a rook block. He can't do either of those things here. King a4, king a2, rook a1 still mate. Rook f2, we've covered that square. So rook takes d4, you've got to sacrifice the rook, and White obviously will win here. This is the thing about these table-based things, is that White managed to somehow set up a position where his pieces are perfectly coordinated against Black's ideas. But in practice, that's very difficult to set up with that accuracy. And like one slight mistake, and you're no longer winning. So it's almost, I wouldn't say it's a guessing game. I mean, if I were trying to win this with White, this would be an entire guessing game. But to some extent, it's that. Okay, so returning to the game, this is the position where we were looking at rook b2, which is apparently the most efficient win in 18, as you can see. Instead, Caruana went bishop to f2, which is also still winning. This still retains the winning advantage. Okay, so rook g5 was played. And here Caruana went rook h7, which again is not the most efficient, apparently. But it still retains the winning advantage. So I assume this is getting boring because we're not going to look at the most efficient win every time because that would be pointless. Let's just get to the moment where the table base claims that White lost his winning advantage. So check, block with the bishop, rook back to, and here rook h8 was played. The table base wants rook b7 to happen. He's trying to go back to the position earlier to set up that win from before with the rook coming to b2. Instead, rook h8 was played. Rook b5. Rook a8 check. Rook a5. So this, yeah. Rook g5. Or sorry, rook h5. And now bishop f6 was played. Which, see, we have to scroll down for that. Bishop f6 apparently throws away the winning advantage. Although, quite honestly, I couldn't tell you why. I think the point is that with bishop f6, Svidler played king a5, and his king was able to escape. Now, with the bishop back on d4, king a5 could always be met by rook a8. But now that the bishop's not on d4 controlling the b6 square, rook a8 is no longer made if the king tries to run. This is my best sort of guess for why bishop f6 throws away the win. So you see now the king is able to run back to a6, and you've basically lost any chance of establishing a mating net. You can't bring the king up because the rook is cutting it off currently. And yeah, the game was drawn from here with more or less accurate play. So yeah, that was explaining that as best I could really understand it. I'm sorry if you found that boring. Yeah, I just wanted to include this screenshot to demonstrate my stockfish being evidently inebriated. This more or less sums up why we use the table base for that last bit. So yeah, some sort of horizon effect. I don't know, man. Rook a3 draw. I yeah. Let's move on. Okay, so we're back to normal. Thank you if you made it through that last bit. Right, so Topalov Nakamura was the only decisive game of the day. They reached this position. It's a double rook and minor piece ending where black's a bit better on account of these rooks are more active and better coordinated, and black's got the better minor piece. So black is both of these pawns are targets. They're both kind of attacked at the moment. So white's got to play with a sense of urgency. He's got to seek counterplay as quickly as possible. The best move here was rook a1, probably, with the point that if black takes, let's say, this guy, the idea is to create counterplay by bringing these rooks in. And, well, for example, if king f6 is played, that's a mistake because after rook f8 check, king g5, rook takes g7. No, not that. Rook takes g7. White gets a lot of play, and he should be winning now after something like this. Black's king is entombed in some sort of mating net, and he's probably going to have to give up material to not get mated. So yeah, he's got to do a different thing, such as, well, if you play knight d7, then you end up in this annoying pin. King e7, bishop c6. Which, by the way, is not losing for black, because he can play king d6, and after bishop takes d7, he can play rook takes g2 and check forever on the second rank. But still, the draw is not a good result considering he was better a second ago. Or you can play rook d7, which is an achievement for white in a sense, because these rooks were sort of doubled on the 7th rank. So to exchange one of those off is sort of an achievement for white. As well as the fact that you still have to deal with this annoying pin, and that's just not very pleasant for black. So that's what white should try. Black shouldn't take this pawn. Also, if he plays rook takes b4, then a similar thing will happen. Rook a8 check, rook c7. Or, sorry, rook a8 check, rook a7. And now after king g8, for example, king e8 fails to bishop d6, king here, and rook f3, and then there's this mate threat, which you have to try to stop, and you have to give up some material to stop that. So you can't do that. If you play king here, then bishop g6 happens, and there's a mate threat. You can see the theme. White's got to bring his rook to the a file, so he can get some counterplay. Now, that definitely wasn't best play from black that was illustrated in those variations, but the point is that white should bring the rook to a1, seek counterplay, and black can't immediately try to grab one of the two hanging pawns because, well, white just gets too much counterplay with his rooks, and black ends up in a mating mating net is what I was trying to say. He ends up in a mating net if he's not careful. It's 3:30 a.m. So he did not play rook a1. He played rook g3, which seems like a sort of irrelevant move. I don't entirely understand it. It doesn't create enough counterplay. Knight takes e5 here is possible. Nakamura chose rook e2 instead, which is reasonable. And rook a1 was played. Now rook a1 is too late. I guess rook takes e2 is objectively the best move. Rook a1 is a good idea in theory, but it's just a move too late. And this rook on g3 is less able to. It's less well coordinated with the rook on a1 to create play against black's king, because there's no like rook c2 or anything. So now Nakamura was able to take this pawn more or less for free. And remembering that the guy on b4 is still under threat. So he tried rook a8 check, king f7, and like if rook a7 check, there's just king f6, and black's king is entirely safe here. So he tried bishop h7 instead, while getting the bishop out of attack and trying sort of desperately to create some play. He's now threatening rook a7 check and rook takes g7, which he couldn't previously have played because his bishop was hanging on e4, so that wouldn't have worked. So Nakamura plays g5 so that his g7 pawn won't hang in that line this time. And Topalov tried bishop g8, which is an attempt to create counterplay, but the bishop just ends up getting stuck there. He should probably, objectively try to bring it back, I guess. But that's sort of an admission of failure, and that's probably not going to help at this point. He went rook f8, and now after king g7, yeah, there's big problems on account of, yeah, these guys are, this bishop is sort of stuck here. And after rook e8, knight g6, white is completely lost, unfortunately. Because, I mean, again, white's pieces just lack coordination. Knight f4 is coming up. G2 is going to be under threat. This bishop is stuck here. This rook is stuck on the back rank covering the bishop, and white's pieces are all this weird entanglement of weirdness. And black's are pretty well coordinated. So he tried bishop takes e6, and after knight f4 he resigned. Because the problem is that this bishop's attacked and pinned, so the only way to save that piece is to play bishop d7. But then the problem is rook takes e8, bishop takes e8, and then the fork, knight e2 check. And black wins. So, yeah, poor Topalov. He now drops to minus whatever he is. And Nakamura is pulled to even, I think, having beaten Topalov twice so far in the tournament. So, Aronian Karyakin was somewhat confusing. They reached this ending where white had an extra piece for just a pawn. Unfortunately for Aronian, that pawn was passed in on a3. So it's not necessarily going to queen by force, but it's going to make white use one of his pieces to permanently stand in front of the pawn. And so that piece is not going to be able to partake in the action normally. So, yeah, there doesn't appear to be any good way for white to make progress here. So they moved around for a while. Again, you can see what I mean about white's pieces always having to babysit the a3 pawn. So black managed to get the pawn on d3. That guy was going to fall off sooner or later. There's no way to win the a2 pawn either. Because, yeah, like, you can't win it using this bishop. And if you try to win it with this knight, that's going to take a lot of turns, and presumably black's going to be able to do stuff in the meantime. f4 was tried. So he's trying to inflict weakness on black's structure, but he's also suffered some structural damage himself. And again, it's only 2 pawns for the piece, but there doesn't appear to be any way to make headway. Black's got no weaknesses, and I don't see really any clear way to pick up this pawn. It's going to take a lot of turns to maneuver your knight to b4, and while you're doing that, black now will be trying to win white's pawns. And we're just going to scroll through this quickly. Yeah, there really wasn't any progress to be made. Even with the rooks off the board, there's still no easy progress to be made. On account of, this time, if you use your king and knight to round up this pawn, black can even just bring his king up and take these guys, and maybe even try to push for a win in that case. So white's even got to be careful a bit himself. But in general, this game is just a draw, which is interesting because at one point it was a whole piece for a pawn, and there was just no progress to be made. So this is just a really, really quick appraisal of this game, but I just thought this was interesting and worth noting, that an extra piece isn't always enough to win, which is neat. And so eventually, we had another 100-plus move game. Eventually, Aronian acquiesced that he wasn't going to win. They even, black elected to trade off his bishop for the knight, and there's still no progress to be made, because this king is not going to be able to get at any of black's pawns. That was a horrible highlighting job. And this bishop's never going to be able to help because it can't leave this pawn. And if this king ever decides to try to come and win this pawn, black's going to come up with his king and take white's guys. So that's kind of interesting. This is sort of a really brief summary of that game, which was really interesting. But I did decide priorities to go with the rook and bishop ending as well as the decisive result over this one. Anyways. So I was going to skip over the Anand Giri game entirely for the sake of brevity, but we have to acknowledge one thing. Giri actually did something exciting, which we have to acknowledge. He had black in this position. There's no objective need to do this, but he sacrificed his bishop on f2. and that made the game pretty exciting. Like, he could just move his queen out of attack and be totally fine. But he decided to make the game interesting with bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2, queen b6. And the idea is that not only has he exposed the king somewhat, but he's gotten rid of the f2 pawn, which means now that the g3 square is something that black can land a piece on, specifically the knight on f6, which now is on a route to g3. He went knight h5, and the threats, of course, knight g3 mates. So you've got to do something about this. G4 was played, so inducing, probably forcing f takes g3 en passant, so getting a second pawn for the piece, but also clogging up the g3 square. So the knight's not going there anymore, but it can go to f4. So white has an extra piece. On the other hand, white's got some stuff around his king. Black's pieces aren't necessarily all that well poised for an attack, despite the exposed nature of white's king. Here, the computer is suggesting rook d4 for Anand, just trying to simplify the position. Instead, he tried bishop d3, which perhaps not quite as accurate, but still fine. The knight came into f4, and yeah, white's king, again, is not the safest. Knight d4 was played, g6, just stopping from any piece from entering f5, as well as, importantly, not allowing bishop takes h7, bishop e4, queen f6. Just going to go over this quickly. Bishop f3, now g2 check, forcing bishop takes g2, and then he went knight d3 check. He got his material back, and the balance was now bishop and knight for rook and pawn, which is more or less even. And this game was later drawn, about 20 or so moves later. But we do have to acknowledge that Giri did sacrifice a piece when it wasn't objectively necessary. So 13 straight draws, but he has managed to provide some entertainment throughout the tournament. A few of his draws, as I recall, were games where he had attacked and the attack was fizzling out, so he decided to give a perpetual. But again, 13 straight draws isn't typically something a player with an exciting reputation manages to attain. But he is consistent, if nothing else. We do have to give that to him. So anyways, I'm going to conclude this because I'm rambling at this point. It's 4:30 in the morning, and I haven't yet decided whether I'm going to try to sleep or just stay awake, because I'm really excited for the last round tomorrow, in which the two guys tied for first get to play. And again, I've got no idea how the tie breaks work, so that should be exciting to find out if they draw their game tomorrow. Anyways, like and subscribe and whatever, and thanks for watching.